No matter what you know or how you feel about the 46th president of the United States, I don't think, on a personal level, individual level, Joe Biden comes across as entirely exciting. I'm not calling him sleepy, but I've heard from numerous people with varying political views. He just comes across somewhat vanilla, a bit hokey perhaps. I'm not trying to start this episode with too much of a political overanalyzation of the president's personality, but I say all of this because, whether it's true or not, many of us do see this current president as a fairly unexciting man, simply on a surface level appearance. Which is why I find it hilarious that while we don't know too many facts about El Presidente, I bet a decent amount of Americans are aware of one of his near lifelong fascinations: trains. The dude fucking loves them. According to himself, he's rode over 2 million miles via Amtrak on the campaign trail, which is why, as the US continues to attempt to come up with options to combat climate change, his presidency may be a critical moment for the future of American transportation. After all, the United States in Biden's life, in fact, operated transit systems on par with other high income countries, but now lags far behind several nations in the EU, China, and various other nations across the globe. Now, it regularly deals with financial and reputational issues, as well as a lack of positive experiences from the general public. However, as the transportation sector continues to grow in the overall percentage of energy usage in the country, and as emissions grow and city traffic heightens, there is no denying our current rate of car usage cannot be sustained forever. But can a national push in public transit save the United States both on economic and environmental fronts? It's a complicated subject, and different people will give you different answers, but choo choo, motherfuckers, we're delving in. Let's do this. If you live in the US in a city of 100,000 or more, chances are you've probably used transit at some point in your life. But that's the thing. It's still only a probability. And that probability is that you've taken it once. Certainly not as a consistent part of your life. It might be, but it probably isn't. I know people who have taken the bus literally once, and often it's a tale of heroism, bravery, and courage. A terrifying plight, endeavoring confusing maps and unfavorable characters. I'm exaggerating a bit, but this is kind of the relationship I feel like many of us, outside of places like New York City, DC, or San Francisco, have with the transit system. An uncomfortable, only if necessary mode of transportation. I know I probably mention it an annoying amount of times, but I grew up in Portland, home to a pretty good transit system, something I'll get into more later. And while I used the Max, or light rail, plenty of times, I remember riding the bus for the first time and being absolutely terrified. Honestly, I don't have any memories of using the bus again until college, where the routes were literally designed around student neighborhoods. To be clear, I don't think my fear was warranted, but it just goes to show the ignorance I had given my inexperience with the bus system. Maybe I'm taking too much from personal and anecdotal experience, but statistically, less than a tenth of Americans use transit as their daily form of transportation. And while places like Canada and nations in the European Union still use cars as the predominant means of getting around, they have much higher ridership rates, especially in most cities, and I would argue overall better relationships with their public transit systems. In the US, public transit often becomes heavily politicized. Some see it as a necessity, others say it forces the majority to pay taxes for a service that only the minority will use. This often leads to it being seen almost as a form of social welfare rather than integral to society's functionality, as seems to be the case in several other nations. Oh, but it wasn't always like this, my fellow Americans. Beginning in the 19th century, cities started incorporating horse drawn streetcars into their daily means of transportation. Eventually, as the nation's power technology improved, these animal drawn versions were replaced by electric streetcars, with thousands and thousands of light rail miles lining the cities of the United States. However, at the same time, the car industry was also experiencing a boom. While only 7.5 million vehicles were registered in 1919, by the end of the 20s, the United States had over 26 million cars on the road. Of course, this time also coincided with the start of the Great Depression, which, while reducing car usage, far more negatively impacted the streetcar industry, given most routes were for daily job commutes, of which there were far less to be had. World War II arguably stalled the decline of streetcars due to the high rates of usage for employees working at industrial factories producing supplies for the military. You'll hear a lot of different theories as to the downfall of streetcars, including an infamous conspiracy in which General Motors, as well as a number of smaller companies, were convicted in 1948 of conspiracy to monopolize interstate commerce in the sale of buses, fuel, and supplies to National City Line subsidiaries, a company who was connected to numerous brands through backroom deals. They were later also accused of attempting to monopolize the transit system as a whole, but were eventually acquitted. Still, this story is used as proof that streetcars fell as a result of big corporations taking them down without playing by the rules. I'm not defending their actions, but what they did affected less than 10% of all streetcar systems across the country. There's no denying it makes for a compelling story, so much so it's been used in pop culture, perhaps most famously in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Part of the plot deals with a mysterious corporation buying up the city's trolley system. It's revealed that the villainous Judge Doom is behind this, who, now in ownership of nearby transit systems, plans to build a freeway directly through Toontown, with a hideous rolling machine filled with freeway dip, which they depict as an acid green fluid. Spoiler alert, it ends with Judge Doom being melted away by his own dip solution. The freeway machine then rolls away and blows through a brick wall, where it looks like it's heading straight for a serene nature background, only to be blown off screen by, of course, a cartoon train. Car companies absolutely played a role in the demise of streetcars, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot we will never know about the automobile takeover of the country, but it doesn't seem as black and white as a cartoony plotline, I guess. No matter what, post-war would absolutely be the final blow for streetcars as a truly viable means of transportation for the majority of Americans, as suburban expansion shifted the demographics of metropolitan areas. Levittown is often referred to as the first suburb, and while that isn't exactly true, rich people with the ability to travel have almost always attempted to live near commerce but outside the direct hustle and bustle of city life. But it is, in fact, at least to my knowledge, the first middle-class suburb designed specifically for automotive access. Cul-de-sacs and meandering, maze-like neighborhoods sprung up, entirely opposite of pre-war street grid setups and exactly the kind of layout that makes linear on-rail transit difficult. Compare this to somewhere like Toronto, which continued to expand in a rectangular shape following the Second World War, and still experiences much higher public transit rates than the average US city to this day. Meanwhile, in the US, with cars becoming increasingly affordable for everyday Americans and new suburbs spreading up all across the country, by the end of the 50s, most households own a vehicle, but rarely did families have two. Some would argue this, in part, is what led to the common mid 20th century household dynamic. Father goes to work, mother stays at home, and with more and more people no longer living in the city close to amenities and public transit, there was often no means for a person at home without a car to really go anywhere beyond their neighborhood. Obviously, this dynamic was a result of ingrained ideas about gender roles, but it could be argued that suburban sprawl reinforced this culture rather than help gender progression, even when just a few years prior it had been necessary for the war's success to have high amounts of women in the workforce. Racism too structured the average suburban demographic. Many suburbs, like Levittown itself, banned black families from moving into the neighborhood. You'll hear many refer to this setup, white people living cities for suburbs that ban people of color, as white flight. 60 years later, we are far from dismantling international displacement, with redlining and clear evidence showing unfair biases in home loan and mortgage opportunities continuing to be a problem. But I'm spiraling to a whole other episode. The point is, while streetcars had all but become a thing of the past, public transit was still very much being used, just in more concentrated pockets of the country. For now, though, the federal government still wanted to help fund and grow public transit, especially due to the clear necessity to restructure service following the so-called white flight. The Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964 provided hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funds for both private and public services across the country, in which they agreed to match the funding of the local city or state. The Urban Mass Transportation Administration, now called the Federal Transit Administration, was created at this time. Discussed by Kennedy before his assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson eventually signed it into law, its goal being to help fund and oversee public transit plans moving forward. So, transit is getting a boost at this time, but so is our highway system, and had been since the mid-50s. I would say both needed to happen based on where the country was heading, but there's no denying more efforts were put into advancing the interstate highway system. Still, big cities throughout the country invested in rapid transit systems, intentionally sprucing up their interiors and design to appeal to higher income riders, people who could afford a car but would choose to take transit for its convenience. This seemed like a good idea, but often these plans were faced with similar challenges. It wasn't enough. I'm picturing the meme of the duct tape guy slapping a tiny piece of tape to a gushing hole in a barrel. Except if you watch the real video ad, at least according to them, that shit fucking works. While the added aesthetic was a nice touch for public transit, it didn't resolve the issue that, in many of the fast expanding cities in America, the rapid line systems no longer fully accommodated most residents, resulting in many trips requiring multiple bus connections, with some systems now operating with separate entities running various transit systems, meaning you could have to pay for two different kinds of tickets in the same day to get to where you're going. To make matters worse, those ticket prices are often locked into contracts to avoid ticket price gouging, which seems like a good idea meant to protect the rider, but when they're locked in for too long and efforts are put into refurbishing public transit, but a large portion of funding comes from ticket fares, a lot more than many other countries, I'll get to that later, public transit companies simply run out of funding, which is usually felt in the form of delayed and, at times, even canceled routes. So you have this vicious cycle where it's more expensive to build public transit systems in suburbs rather than in an urban area, which means if you can't afford a car, you probably can't live too far away into the suburbs, which means the immediate demand for transit in suburbs is low, which de-incentivizes governments to invest in expanding, which perpetuates socioeconomic disparities between city and suburb residents, and around we go. In the 80s, we started to see a new form of public transit sprout up across the country, the commuter rail. By now, cities were already dealing with highway expansion issues, traffic, and a lack of ability to connect people and reduce travel time with more roads. So these commuter things became a thing, some even using railing that by then was mostly used only for freight cars. While this helped people as far as convenience and traffic jams, it wasn't really reducing people's car usage, as most people would drive from their homes to whatever commuter station was closest to their destination, park there, and take the train the rest of the way. Certain cities saw this issue and combated it with the light rail system. And who was one of the first to operate a modernized version of this? Oh yeah, baby, Portland, Oregon. Oh, is he really going to talk about Portland? Yeah, I'm going to fucking talk about Portland again. And in this case, there's really no other city I can talk about, because PDX could be called the light rail trendsetter in the United States. Opened in 1986, Portland's Max Light Rail was intended to ride lines that were actually on the same roads as cars and could be woven into the city's transit system much easier than other forms of rail, such as the subway, which would require far more construction. By the 90s, many cities were light railing, but not without complications. Because while federal funding had been investing in the creation of light rail, there hadn't really been any place to allocate large amounts of funds to maintaining the rails. So these nice systems get built, but without a plan to finance maintenance and daily operations, services are affected, with one of the most extreme cases being Cleveland's Waterfront Line, which for years only had trains running twice a week. During the Obama presidency, There were some federal pushes for transit expansion. $10 billion of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 were dedicated to improving rail lines, with Obama saying it would be, quote, the largest investment in infrastructure since the interstate highway system was created. Things did not go as planned. The $10 billion was dispersed unevenly, meaning certain regions saw much higher amounts of funding than others. But still, parts of the country, like the Midwest and Florida, still had big projects in store. Then the 2010 midterms happened. A staunch, anti-Obama sentiment, along with the rise of the burgeoning Tea Party movement, led to Republicans seeing a net gain of 63 seats in the House of Representatives and 11 Republicans replacing Democratic governors across the country. Less enthused to support public transit projects, many plans were derailed. I don't have a better word. It's not meant to be some cute fucking pun. No, it's just the best word. But yeah, you have situations like in Wisconsin, where Governor Scott Walker attempted to redistribute $810 million that had been allocated for a Madison to Milwaukee line, instead calling it for it to be used for road improvements. When he was told this wasn't possible, he rejected the funds altogether. Governor John Kasich of Ohio rejected a $400 million transit line linking Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus, believing the predicted 50 miles per hour speed the line would travel would not be enough to attract riders. In Florida, Governor Rick Scott actually had the chance to take in a great portion of the profits Ohio and Wisconsin had rejected, but still said no, deeming his state's rail proposals too uncertain and far too little long-term benefit, while adding that the government, quote, has become addicted to spending beyond its means and we cannot continue this flawed policy, end quote. Some states did in fact end up using federal funds to improve their public transit systems. Vermont, for instance, currently has 150 more miles of transit rail than it did a decade ago. Between Milwaukee and Chicago, transit bridges have been improved to allow passengers to cross tracks without slowing down rail lines. And while it's still in the works, a Trenton to New Brunswick, New Jersey line is supposed to travel at 160 miles per hour, which would hopefully lead to much more commerce and job opportunities between the 30 miles or so that separates the two cities. Currently, light rails have had varying degrees of success across the country, with places like Los Angeles, Dallas, and Seattle able to incorporate light rail usage into many residents' lives, while even helping certain cities revitalize struggling downtown areas. Which is cool, but downtown, nightlife, those go hand in hand with a service that allows you not to drive. Traffic is still a big issue in all the cities I mentioned, and while a boozy train ride with your friends can be fun, if light rails are too slow for your daily commute and the buses are stuck in the same traffic as all the cars, chances are you probably just want to be left alone in your own personal metal box at 8 a.m. And that's the problem. As far as daily work commutes, the light rail and commuter rail lines are still far from making a true dent. Which raises the question, what's the point of public transit in the United States? Obviously, it's to help provide affordable transportation, but in a time where roads are constantly congested, where the United States is second in the world in total annual carbon emissions, at a time when transportation has officially surpassed the electrical and industrial sectors as our country's leading source of emissions, how much good is it doing? I want to stop here with a disclaimer. I do not have an agenda with this episode. Quite frankly, I'm a pretty dumb guy, and I have to do a lot of reading and a lot of processing to understand big issues, especially in a world like transportation and technology, neither of which I would call myself an expert in, by any means. But I live researching, and as I'm sure you know, and I've heard many politicians and scientists say, we can't keep treating the planet the way we currently do and expect things to be okay in 100 or a couple hundred years down the line. So while a lot of the stuff moving forward is going to deal with the present and potential future, I'm not trying to promote one single idea. I do not have the solution to solving the numerous problems affecting our transit system, not to mention our fucking planet. But I do think it's worth looking into the things that are being done and planned and how those things could affect us moving forward. Cool? Groovy? Okay. So, to better understand the United States public transit system, I think it makes sense to compare it to those of other nations. The Eurail, for example, is world known. Even if you don't really know anything about it, you probably know there's a train that can get you to the majority of countries across the continent. So let's start across the old pond. One of the main reasons Europe sees far higher rates and better quality of transit is, back in the mid-20th century, as places like the United States, Canada, and Europe were all on similar paths as far as implementing cars more regularly into society, Other nations put far more efforts into funding the modernization of their transit systems with the intention of growing public transit along with the burgeoning car industry. It seems that the extra investment paid off because, while cars are still by far the number one form of transportation in Europe, metropolitan areas see much higher rates of passenger usage. Because European cities tended to expand with public transit in mind, there was less of a hard split between suburbs and cities, which in part kept many people of all social classes regularly using public transit. Today, citizens of many European nations view it as vital to society rather than a form of social welfare, as is the approach many American politicians and voters take. In a way, it's hard to blame them, considering European transit has a much wider reach. Meanwhile, in the US, you have a situation where several cities of 100,000 or more offer little in public transit, or even 5 cities which were found to offer none, according to a study done by 24/7 Wall Street. To add to this, as I mentioned earlier, Americans pay more in public transit through their ticket fares than many other countries, meaning it can feel like you're paying more and getting less. Not so apparent differences also alter the efficacy of public transit from country to country, like the fact that in Canada, where while they do have Transport Canada, the department that oversees this sector of the government, they have no national equivalent to the Department of Transportation as far as funding goes. That's handled far more at the regional level, making less people feel that like they are paying for something that they do not have access to. The capitals of European and Australian state, region, and provinces, any big chunk of land, split into a governmental area, tend to be the biggest cities, whereas in the US, a lot of capitals are far from the largest metropolitan areas across the state. Number one, that's less incentive for state officials to fund public transit. And number two, government workers are known to be some of the most frequent public transit users, so it simply takes away from potential riders by having them work in a more driver-friendly city. All of this, and I mentioned it a bit, but all of this, I think, has created just a different culture surrounding public transit from nation to nation. When I was reading about the European Union and transit systems within those nations, I found that many have their bus and train stops spaced out far more than here in the US. This leads to more efficient rides, but more walking for riders. In one of the big reports on EU transit, they in fact mentioned that walking from stop to stop actually helps get Europeans a good amount of their recommended daily exercise. Like as in, that's a good thing. Which, I don't know about you, but I do not see flying as a positive angle in the United States. Quite often, we hear the argument that public transit is unfair to older citizens or that it does not allow people with physical ailments to use it. But Europeans who fall into either of these categories ride transit at much higher rates than their American counterparts. Speaking of rates, let's talk numbers. In a report from 2017 data, Switzerland clocked in pretty damn high at 2,451 kilometers a year, topping the EU. Places like Austria, Sweden, and France are in the 1,300 to 1,500 range, and 14th ranked Spain, for reference, averages 589 kilometers a year. Americans hit 296 kilometers on average for all sources of public transportation, or 184 miles. These numbers are obviously quite wide-ranging, but they're nothing compared to that of a single nation, China. China boasts the 4 largest metro systems in the world and 13 of the top 20, with over 7,500 kilometers or 4,660 miles of subway and metro lines across the country. After opening several streetcar-style transit systems in the early 20th century, the centralized Chinese government of the mid-20th century did not push for major public transit across the country, but rather in a handful of selected cities. But after the death of leader Mao Zedong and the jailing of the communist leaders infamously referred to as the Gang of Four, those tasked with revitalizing the nation's economy did a much better job of organizing successful plans by the end of the 80s. As cities modernized nationwide, the Chinese government attempted to keep up with public transit to accommodate for the increase of urban jobs and commutes, but due to their sheer population, ran into budgeting issues and halted several transit system plans. That was the 90s. As China continued to grow at seemingly supersonic speeds, eventually they realized the absolute necessity public transit would be to function in major cities. And because of this, the Chinese government has invested immensely in numerous projects over the last decade or so. They've reduced the population required from 3 million to 1.5 million for cities who wish to start public transit planning. Roughly half of all current operational transit lines in China have been built since 2009. Simply put, their government saw the sheer disarray a lack of plentiful public transit would cause, and have done everything they can to avoid such disasters. China has 20 cities home to over 5 million residents. the US has one, New York. Of course, we have 9 if you include metropolitan areas, but as we've seen, it's the densest cities that tend to use the most public transit. Chinese cities tend to be much more centralized geographically. Where a place like the LA area is home to 12.5 million people, the city proper population is less than 4 million. Major Chinese cities do not see this dramatic of a difference between city and metro populations, and because of this, public transit can more easily access more people in less space. In China, there are 204 vehicles for every 1,000 citizens, to the United States' 842. That said, much of this is to be accounted for by the huge economic disparity between modernization in urban versus rural China, where even the most basic needs such as transportation and clean water access continue to be an issue. Further, China and the US rank first and second respectively in both total carbon emissions and emissions per capita. So obviously it's not just the cars we drive to work that are fucking up the environment, but often the jobs we're going to. And that's the complicated thing. Public transit is not some universal economic and environmental lifesaver. It takes specific practices from systems to be successful, and regular modernization. Otherwise, places are always playing catch-up. In the US, the issue is extremely contentious politically, and that seems to be part of the reason we're in the kind of situation we find ourselves in. I know I touched on that briefly, but I'm actually going to end here, and in part 2, I'm going to go into more of the recent efforts to invest in public transit, as well as the future of transportation for Americans as a whole. Fickle Future is written, edited, and produced by me, Ruben Estrada. Music by Hobby Beats. You can find all of his work on Linktree/HobbyBeats. The URL is located in the episode's description. Cover art by Laura Batson. As always, thank you for listening.